There are things that live at the edge of what we can explain, not in the dramatic sense, not the way stories usually begin, with music swelling and voices dropping to a whisper. I mean the quiet kind of inexplicable, the kind that settles into a corner of your memory and refuses to leave, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many rational explanations you try on, like coats that never quite fit. The accounts you are about to hear were shared over time by people who mostly don't know each other, from different parts of the country, different walks of life. What they have in common is simple. They all went into the woods, they all came back, and they all saw something that they still cannot fully describe. These are not stories about monsters. They are not stories about violence or attacks. They are something quieter, and because of that, something harder to dismiss. They are stories about noticing, about the specific unease that comes from realizing that something else, something large and patient and deeply camouflaged, has been noticing you too. The forests of North America are vast. The old growth areas, the protected wilderness, the private timberland, the untapped hollows taken together. There is more investigated terrain in this continent than most of us are comfortable thinking about. Ecologists regularly find new species, new behaviors, new evidence of animals living in places we assumed were empty. We make assumptions about what we have named and cataloged. We assume that anything large enough to leave a visible impression on the world is something we would already know about. These accounts suggest, quietly and consistently, that we may be wrong about that. Settle in, because from here on, the story doesn't need to be seen, only heard. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are tonight. There's something worth knowing about who else is out there in the dark, listening along. Story 1. The survey line. I stopped trusting my eyes that summer. Not completely, just enough that when I looked at something now, I gave myself a beat before I decided what I was seeing. I was hired to walk survey lines for a private land company, timber assessment mostly. You go in with a compass bearing, follow the line through the brush, mark trees, note ground cover, flag anything that might complicate a boundary. It is not glamorous work. You spend a lot of hours alone in the woods with nothing but insects and your own footsteps and the small arithmetic of distance and direction. This was mid-July, southern Ohio, up near the old Hocking Hills region, private land that hadn't been worked in decades. The kind of forest that feels thick in a way that goes beyond just tree density. The undergrowth was layered, moss on everything, ferns in the shadows, lichens creeping up every available surface. The whole place had a softness to it, if that makes sense. Like the forest was padded, like it had been accumulating material for a very long time and had simply not stopped. I was on day 3 of a 5-day job. Nothing unusual up to that point. Some deer sign, some old logging roads, a couple of spots where the drainage had cut channels deeper than expected. Normal stuff. I was moving along a northeast bearing, maybe 2 hours out from my truck, when I noticed the sound first. Or rather, the absence of it. I had been tracking through an area with a lot of birdsong. Nothing remarkable, just the ambient noise of a summer woods. And then, quite suddenly, it stopped. All of it. Not in the way that birds go quiet when a predator passes through. This was immediate, total, like someone had cut a line. I paused, checked my compass, looked around. The tree line was dense on both sides. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Nothing moved. I kept walking. About 100 yards further, I came to a shallow ravine, maybe 8 feet deep, with a creek running along the bottom. I needed to cross it to stay on my bearing, so I found a spot where the bank was low enough to scramble down, cross the creek on some stones, and climbed up the other side, holding onto roots to pull myself over the lip. That's when I saw it. Or rather, that's when I saw what I first thought was a deadfall. A large log covered heavily in moss, propped at an odd angle against a tree. It was only when I looked at it a second time, really looked, the way you look when something pulls your attention before your rational mind can name why, that I noticed the proportions weren't right for a log. It was vertical, mostly. The thing I had been looking at was standing. I stopped moving. My brain was doing what brains do, running through the catalog of things it could be. A stump with unusual growth. A cluster of vines around a thin tree. My eyes playing tricks in the uneven, dappled light of that particular afternoon. Because it had a shape. Not a clear shape, not a defined one. More like the general suggestion of something upright, roughly the height of a tall person, wider at what might have been the shoulders, narrowing slightly below. And it was covered, not with clothing or fur, with something soft and layered, dark green and dark gray, moss or something like it. Patches of it, thick and uneven, like the surface of old wood left out in a damp climate for decades. The kind of growth that accrues over years into something that changes the shape of what it grows on. I did not move for what felt like an entire minute. Neither did it. I was close enough that I should have been able to see breathing. Some rise and fall in the chest, some shift of weight. There was none. It was absolutely still. Still in the way that trees are still when there is no wind. That particular kind of stillness that belongs to living things that are not moving by choice, as opposed to objects that cannot move. I took one step back. Slow. Quiet as I could manage in the leaf litter. The thing turned its head. I say, turned. I didn't see a face. I didn't see eyes. What I saw was a rotation in the upper portion of the shape, a slow reorientation, as though whatever was at the top of it had shifted its attention in my direction. Deliberate, unhurried, the movement of something that has no reason to be startled. I backed up several more steps, watching it, and then I turned and walked quickly back toward my truck. I did not run. Something about running felt like it would change the situation in a way I wasn't prepared for. I got back to my truck without incident. I turned the job in unfinished. Told the company I'd had a family situation. I still think about the stillness, the way something that large can hold itself so completely motionless. And I think about the way it turned toward me, the specificity of that. Whatever it was not afraid of me, and it was not surprised by me, which suggests that it had known I was there before I knew it was. That last part is the part that keeps coming back years later in quiet rooms. Story 2. The photograph that started it. My grandmother used to say there are some questions you don't want the answers to, because the answer just gives you more questions, and those ones are worse. I understand what she meant now. This was about 11 years ago. I was 18, and my older brother Marcus had been doing amateur wildlife photography for a few years by then, mostly birds and deer. He was genuinely good at it, patient, methodical, the kind of guy who would sit in a blind for 6 hours without complaint, because the light at hour 6 was different from the light at hour 1. He came home one evening from a solo outing up in the Appalachian foothills, and something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. He wasn't shaking or pale. He just had this look, quiet in a way that wasn't usual for him, like he'd been turned off somewhere and hadn't quite come back on. He sat at the kitchen table, looking at his camera screen. Finally, I asked him what he got. He handed me the camera. The shot was taken from a good distance. Telephoto lens, late afternoon light. That golden hour light coming through the trees at a low angle, turning everything amber and copper. In the frame was a creek bank, some lichen-covered rocks, and hemlock trees. Standard composition. But on the edge of the frame, half behind one of the hemlocks, was something else. It looked like a person, roughly, upright, two-limbed, the approximate proportions of a human standing with arms at the sides, but it was entirely covered in what looked like green and gray growth, mottled, uneven. It blended so completely with the surrounding forest that it would have been invisible if not for the specific angle of the late light, which caught the very edge of it and separated it slightly from the background. The unsettling part was the posture. It was looking toward the camera, not at the general area, at the lens. There was a directness to the orientation that made it clear the thing in that photograph was not looking at the forest or the sky. It was looking at the specific rectangle of glass that Marcus had pointed at it, and Marcus hadn't seen it when he took the photo. He'd been focused on a red-tailed hawk on the other side of the frame. He only noticed the shape when he was reviewing the shots on the walk back to his car. He sold the camera a few months later, said he had lost interest in wildlife photography. But I have thought about that photograph more times than I can count. The specificity of the attention, the way it had oriented itself toward the lens before Marcus even knew he was taking that shot. Whatever was standing behind that hemlock was not surprised by his presence. It was aware of him in a way that he, with all his patience and fieldcraft, had not been aware of it. Story 3. The Night Patrol. I worked in private security for about 6 years. A lot of that time was spent doing overnight patrols at various facilities. The work is mostly uneventful. You walk, you check, you log, you walk again. This contract was with a private nature preserve in western North Carolina, about 400 acres of old-growth mixed forest. My job was to walk designated routes twice per shift and log any signs of intrusion. It was December, cold but not bitter, clear skies, good moon. The second week of the contract. I was on the midnight route, moving along the eastern perimeter trail when I smelled something. Wet, organic. The deep smell of old leaves and standing water, but with something underneath it. Heavier, more animal. Not unpleasant exactly, but persistent and strong in the cold air. I paused, swept my light across the tree line. Nothing. I kept walking. About a quarter mile further, the trail passed through a low area where a seasonal creek ran. There was a wooden footbridge, and beyond it, the trail curved north along the edge of a stand of white pines. I crossed the bridge and stopped. 12 to 15 feet ahead, standing in the middle of the trail between two of the pines, was something. My flashlight hit it full on. It didn't move away from the light the way an animal would. Didn't flinch, didn't turn. Just stood there, illuminated in the center of my beam. My first instinct was trespasser, human. But the dimensions weren't right. Too wide across the upper body. The silhouette had a roughness to it, a texture, like it was layered over rather than wearing something. Tall, 6.5 feet, I estimated. Maybe more. I said, "Hey, this is private property. You're gonna need to leave." No response, no movement. The thing shifted, not dramatically. It moved its weight from one side to the other, the way a person shifts when they've been standing in one place for too long and the stillness has become uncomfortable. That was the detail that lodged in me. Such a recognizably human thing to do. A small, automatic adjustment that bodies make when standing still costs something. Whatever this was, something in it got uncomfortable, and it shifted, the way a person shifts. I reached for my radio, called in a possible trespasser. Dispatch acknowledged. When I looked back up from the radio, it was gone. No sound of movement, no crashing through the underbrush, just absent. The backup arrived 20 minutes later. We found nothing useful. The ground near the creek should have held impressions, but where the thing had been standing there were only some compressed areas in the moss that the other officer said could have been made by anything. I filed the incident as possible trespasser, unconfirmed. But I left out the detail about the weight shift. I couldn't write that part in a professional context because it was the one detail that made everything else impossible to dismiss. Something with a body that works the way bodies work. Something that standing still costs something. Story 4. What my uncle saw. I didn't see this myself, but I was there for the aftermath, and I know my uncle well enough to know when he is telling the truth. This is the one story he has never changed. Not a detail, not a word. He was 23, working timber in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. One Thursday in late September, he got separated from the crew while investigating a sound off to the north. He walked for about an hour before he got his bearings. During that hour, he came to a hillside with a natural depression in it. A wide, shallow bowl, maybe 30 feet across, the kind of formation left when a large tree falls and the root ball tears up the earth. In that bowl, almost perfectly centered on a large, flat boulder, was something sitting. He described it this way, like a person who had decided to become part of the forest. The thing was sitting with its legs pulled in, arms resting on its knees, and its entire body was covered in moss and lichen so thick and complete that the moss appeared to be the body. The line between the organism and what had grown on it was invisible. The head was down. Whatever it had in the place of a face was angled toward the ground. It was not moving. My uncle watched it for a long time. He thought initially it was a stump, but stumps don't sit. The posture was unambiguous once he let himself see it as posture, resting, folded in, an organism at ease. He was about to step back when it raised its head, not toward him. It raised its head and tilted it slightly, the way an animal orients when it hears something at a distance that the human beside it cannot hear. Precise, directional. It was listening to something my uncle could not detect. He backed away slowly until the depression was out of sight, found the trail, got back to the crew, said nothing. He told me about it for the first time when I was 12, sitting on his porch on a summer evening. He said he had been thinking about it more recently. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he didn't know. He said maybe the better question was how long it had been doing that, sitting in that bowl, on that rock, listening to things that do not reach the frequency of human hearing. Story 5. The girl who hiked alone. Dina hiked alone regularly. She had done it for years. She was experienced, well-equipped, not someone who scared easily or let her imagination run ahead of her observation. This was the Olympic Peninsula, the rainforest area, a less traveled segment of trail. 3 years ago. If you have been there, you know the quality of the place. It is dense in a way that feels ancient. The moss hangs off everything. The silence there is more present than other silences, more like something active than simply the absence of noise. She had camped 2 nights without incident. She was in good spirits going into the 3rd morning. She told me this specifically, and I believe her. About an hour into walking, she rounded a curve in the trail and stopped. On the uphill side of the trail, about 20 feet above her, on a slope entirely blanketed in the deep, saturated green moss of that forest, something was standing. It was close enough that she could see the texture of it. The texture matched the slope so precisely that her visual system kept trying to read it as part of the hillside. But the shape was wrong for terrain. It was standing with its back to her, looking uphill, large enough that she thought, not as a complete thought, but as a physical response. That thing is too large to move the way a person moves. She said it was not motionless. It was doing something. Some slow, continuous movement. It looked like it was moving its hands, in front of its face, perhaps, or close to the ground. Small, deliberate motions with no purpose she could identify. She stood and watched it for approximately 2 minutes. Then it stopped moving. And without any transition she could follow, without any preceding motion or warning, it was simply facing her. She ran. She doesn't remember deciding to. She came back to herself at a creek crossing, standing in ankle-deep water, breathing hard, with no memory of the intervening distance. When I ask her what it was, she says she doesn't know. But the part that bothers her most is the 2 minutes she stood there before she ran. The fact that she didn't run immediately. She says she thinks she didn't run because the thing didn't feel threatening. It felt, she says, like it was not concerned with her, like she was present, but not particularly significant, not worth interrupting for, like she had been assessed and found unremarkable. That indifference is what stays with me, being known and dismissed. Story 6. The ranger's account. A former park ranger told me this story over coffee at a diner in Central Oregon. He had retired a few years earlier. He was a calm man, deliberate, not given to embellishment. Precision had been professionally required of him for decades, and he had never quite unlearned it. He asked me not to identify which park. I am honoring that. The incident happened in his 3rd year on the job, during a solo patrol of a remote trail section. He was checking for storm damage after a wet spring. About 7 miles from the nearest trailhead, the trail ran along a ridge with a steep drop into a forested valley. He stopped to eat lunch there, watched a pair of ravens working the thermals below him. Ordinary. He noticed it when he stood up to continue. Down in the valley, maybe a 1/4 mile below the ridgeline, something was moving through the trees. Slowly. Upright. He got out his binoculars. What he saw fit no category he had. Upright and bipedal, clearly, but the entire surface of it appeared to be overgrown, not clothed, covered. Matching the surrounding forest so closely that every time he looked away and looked back, he had to find it again. He watched it for several minutes. At each pause, it would touch the trunk of a tree with what he read as both hands. A brief, deliberate contact. Not grabbing or bracing, more like a greeting or a reading. He said it reminded him, uncomfortably, of a person moving through a house in total darkness, using the walls to navigate by feel. After a few minutes, it stopped, and it looked up at the ridge where he was standing. He lowered the binoculars, looked away. A deliberate choice he couldn't fully explain, except that maintaining that sightline felt wrong in a way his body communicated before his mind caught up. When he looked back, it was gone. He asked me, before we said goodbye, whether other people had described similar things. I told him they had. He sat with that for a moment. He said, "I always wondered if it was the same one, moving around, or whether there are a lot of them and we just aren't trained to see them." I didn't have a good answer, but I have thought about what it would mean if he was right. If the perceptual filtering we use to classify things quickly and move on is something these things have learned to take advantage of, something that has leer, he said, "I always wondered if it was the same one, moving around, or whether there are a lot of them and we just aren't trained to see them." I didn't have a good answer, but I have thought about what it would mean if he was right. If the perceptual filtering we use to classify things quickly and move on is something these things have learned to take advantage of. Something that has learned how human attention works, what it focuses on, what it dismisses, how long it takes a person to decide that something they almost saw was just a shadow. That would be a kind of intelligence, not our kind, but a kind. Story 7. 17 days. This account was sent to me in writing by a man I will call R. He asked that his real name not be used. He was part of a small wilderness survival training program, a private group of 5 people practicing extended wilderness immersion, going into remote forested areas with minimal gear and living from the land. They had done shorter trips before. This was their most ambitious, 17 days. The first week was unremarkable. By day 8, they had established routines, and the hypervigilance of the early days had relaxed. They knew their perimeter well. The first indication of something different came on the night of day 9. R was on watch, sitting by the banked fire. Around 2 in the morning, the forest went quiet. Not just reduced, entirely quiet. Every insect, every small animal movement, every ambient sound of a living forest gone at once, like being in a room when the electricity cuts out. He woke the others without speaking, They sat together for 20 minutes. Nothing happened. The sounds came back gradually, and they went back to sleep. It happened again the following night, and the night after that. No one spoke about it directly. On day 13, R walked alone to a stream to collect water. Halfway there, he stopped. Standing in the path between two large conifers was something he described as a figure, tall, entirely covered in what he initially read as layered foliage, until he registered that it was not moving in the slight breeze that was moving everything else around it. He stood still. It stood still. What happened next is the hardest part for him to put into words. He was frightened, but the fear was secondary. Running underneath something he can only describe as the sensation of being recognized, not acknowledged, not seen exactly. Recognized the way you recognize a feature of a landscape you have passed many times. Unremarkable, known, part of the expected inventory of the place. He took a different path to the water source and back. The path was empty when he returned. They finished the 17 days. They drove home. R told me that since then, he sometimes wakes in the night with the distinct sensation of being observed. Not threatened, just monitored. The way something watches over something it is keeping track of. He doesn't hike alone anymore. Not because he is afraid of what he might see, but because he is not sure what it would mean to be recognized a second time. Whether that would represent an escalation. Whether being noticed twice by something that patient means something different than being noticed once. Story 8. Watercolor. A landscape painter. A woman in her late 60s. Contacted me after hearing some of these accounts described secondhand. She said she had painted something years ago that she had never been able to explain and had never shown to anyone. We met, and she showed me the painting. It was a watercolor, approximately 14 inches wide and 8 tall. A forest interior, lush, green, densely detailed. Ferns, moss, the vertical columns of large conifers. Morning light, she said. She always painted in the field in the early mornings. And in the painting, partially obscured behind the trunk of a large hemlock in the middle distance, was a shape, a form she had not intended to paint. She had been working quickly, absorbed in the light on the ferns, and had not consciously registered the shape in her peripheral vision. She painted what she saw, as she always did, without editing. When she looked at the finished painting that evening in better light, she saw it there, rendered in her own brushstrokes, clearly and specifically, and understood that she had painted it from observation without knowing it. She had been less than 6 feet from where it was standing. The shape in the painting was upright, partially behind the tree. The color was consistent with the surrounding moss and bark, and it was looking at her. She went back to the location once, with the painting as reference. She found the hemlock. She stood in the spot where the shape would have been. The moss on the ground there was disturbed in a particular way, not recently, but clearly, compressed areas, long and deep, as though something with substantial weight had returned to that spot many times over an extended period. She asked me whether I thought it had been there a long time, whether it had watched her before. I told her I didn't know. She rolled the painting up and put it back in its tube. She said she had thought about burning it many times, but never did. She said she wasn't entirely sure what burning it would accomplish, and that the not burning was therefore not avoidance, but something more like honesty. I understood exactly what she meant. Story 9. The Map Maker. This one came to me through a cartography professor who had spent several summers doing field work for a topographic survey project in the Cascade Range. I will call her Clara. Clara was meticulous by training and inclination. Cartographers generally are. Her job required her to record what she observed accurately and to trust what her instruments told her over what her interpretations wanted to believe. She was not a person who embellished or speculated beyond what the data supported. She had been working a particular survey grid for 3 days, alone, in dense coniferous forest at approximately 4,000 feet elevation. The work required her to move through the grid in a systematic traverse, walking a specific line, taking readings, moving to the next line, repeating. On the second afternoon, she noticed that something in the trees, uphill from her position, had been in the same location for an unusual length of time. She had not seen it arrive. She became aware of it the way you become aware of something that has always been there. A shape among the trees about 60 feet away that her peripheral vision had been flagging as significant for some minutes before her conscious attention finally caught up. Roughly the height and general proportions of a person, not moving, facing her. Clara was a scientist. Her immediate response was to observe it with the same attention she gave to everything else. She noted the position, the apparent dimensions, the surface texture, which appeared soft and irregular and consistent with heavy moss growth. She noted the stillness. She noted that it was oriented toward her and had apparently been so for some time. She made a notation in her field book: date, time, location, description. Then she went back to her work. She told me this without apology or embarrassment. She said standing there staring at it seemed no more productive than continuing to work. If it was going to do something, it would do it regardless. If not, she had a grid to finish. She finished her readings and walked back toward base camp on a route that took her close to where the shape had been. There was no shape. There was a section of mossy ground that was compressed in a pattern she noted as inconsistent with normal terrain deformation. She also noted, without comment, that the compression pattern was approximately the size of something very large, and that based on her survey data, that particular patch of ground had a clear sight line to every position she had occupied during the previous 2 days. She showed me the field book. The notation was there in her precise small handwriting: time, location, description, dimensions. And then, at the bottom of that page, 2 words she couldn't account for adding: still there. She said she didn't remember writing that. It didn't fit the notation format she used for everything else. She must have written it between readings in a moment she didn't consciously register. She still wasn't sure when she told me exactly what she had meant by it. Story 10. The second honeymoon. A couple in their mid-40s. I'll call them Tom and Elise. Had booked a remote cabin in the Smoky Mountains for their 20th anniversary. Genuinely remote, accessible by a single dirt road, backed up against national forest land. They wanted quiet. 2 weeks without obligations. The first 4 days were everything they had hoped for. Long walks, unhurried evenings, the ease that comes from being very far from everything that requires you. On the 5th day, Elise noticed something on the slope behind the cabin. She was sitting on the back porch with her coffee in the early morning, watching the light come through the trees. She had done this every morning. She knew the view. That morning, on a section of the slope she had been looking at for 4 days, something was different. There was a shape at the base of a large maple, about 100 feet from the cabin. She watched it for a long time before calling Tom out. They stood together and looked at it. Tom said it looked like a person standing very still. Elise said it looked like part of the tree. They looked at it for a long time without being able to agree. Then it moved. Not suddenly. It simply shifted its weight, the slow, subtle movement of a body adjusting its position. And then it was still again. They went inside, sat together at the kitchen table, did not speak for several minutes. Tom went back to the porch window and looked out. The shape was gone. They stayed for the full 2 weeks. Neither of them could explain, afterward, why. Elise said it seemed important not to leave. She said leaving would feel like a statement, and she wasn't sure what statement it would make, but she was uneasy about making it. They saw the shape twice more during the remaining 9 days, both times in the early morning, both times on the slope. Both times when they looked too long or too directly, it was gone by the time they looked again. On the last morning, before they loaded the car, Elise walked up the slope to the maple. She said she needed to. She said she felt she owed it something, though she couldn't say what. The ground around the tree was undisturbed, or rather, disturbed in ways she couldn't read. The moss was uneven, compressed in some places and not others, in a pattern that felt intentional without suggesting anything specifically. She stood there for a while. She said hello, quietly, to whatever might be listening. Tom called her name from the driveway. She walked back down. She said she felt, as she walked away, not watched, not followed, not threatened, just noticed. Quietly and thoroughly noticed, by something that had been doing it longer than she had been there. Story 11. The hunting blind. My father was a hunter, not a trophy hunter. A practical one, deer mostly, every fall, the way his father had done it. It was part of the calendar, ordinary and seasonal. He had a spot he used for 30 years, the back corner of our family's property where it met the state forest line. A small permanent blind he had built himself, 8 feet up in the fork of a large red oak. He knew every sound that forest made at every time of year. He came home one November afternoon. I was in college, this was maybe 12 years ago, and he was quiet in a way I'd never seen from him, still in a way that his body usually wasn't. He told me at dinner that he'd had an unusual morning. He'd been sitting in the blind before first light when he heard something moving below him. Slow, heavy. He assumed at first it was a deer, possibly a buck. As the light came up, he could see more clearly. And what was below the blind was not a deer. He described it carefully. Upright, moving slowly through the understory, pausing at intervals, turning its head as though checking its surroundings, covered in something he couldn't clearly identify in the low light. Dark green, dark gray, something soft-looking, something that made the outline of it indistinct against the trees. He had been sitting in that blind for 3 decades. He had a complete catalog of what belonged in that forest at every season and every hour. Whatever this was, it was not in the catalog. He sat absolutely still. The thing passed below the blind without looking up. It moved north, following the edge of a low drainage area, and was gone into denser cover. He climbed down when it was fully light and found where it had walked. The leaf litter was disturbed in a trail. Long strides, consistent in depth, heavier than a deer, but not the dragging impact of a bear. Something that walked upright, 2-footed, through a forest it knew well. When I asked what he thought it was, he said he didn't know. He said it probably had a reasonable explanation. Then he paused and said, "But I've been sitting in that blind for 30 years, and I've never felt like I was the one being checked on." He retired the blind after that season. Didn't sell it, didn't tear it down, just stopped going. I think about what he said, about the implication of it, which is that the checking had always been happening, long before that particular morning, and that the blind was not a hiding place in the way he had always assumed it was. Story 12. The last week of August. I'll close with this one. It's the most recent. It happened to me. I should say first, I don't go looking for these things. I collect these accounts because they were brought to me, and because there is a consistency to them that I find more compelling and more unsettling with each new telling. I am, in most respects, a skeptical person who has become less skeptical slowly and reluctantly over a long period of time. Last August, I went camping in the Allegheny National Forest. 6 nights, solo. I wanted the kind of thinking time that only comes with extended quiet, and the backcountry gives me that in a way nothing else does. It has been my practice for years. I know how to be out there. The first 4 nights were ordinary in the best sense of the word. Good weather, clear skies, the gradual unwinding that comes from being away from everything artificial long enough that your nervous system forgets it was ever compressed. On the fifth night, I woke up at approximately 3 in the morning for no reason I could identify. No sound had startled me, no physical discomfort, no dream I could recall. I was simply awake, in the complete and immediate way that you are awake when something registers below the level of conscious awareness. I lay still and listened. The night was quiet, not unusually quiet, just the normal night sounds of that particular forest. Insects, a distant owl, intermittent, nothing immediately unusual. Then I smelled something. Wet earth, organic, deep and specific. The smell of a forest after long rain, of decay and growth combined, of standing water and old leaves and the particular heaviness of very old organic material. Strong enough that my first thought was that I had camped near a bog without knowing it. But I knew the area. There was no bog. I lay still. The smell peaked and then faded slowly over 15 minutes, and then it was gone. I eventually went back to sleep. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the camp. Nothing seemed unusual. And then, about 40 feet uphill from the tent on the slope behind the camp, I found it. A section of ground, approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, where the moss had been heavily compressed. Flattened. The moss was matted down and damp and had not sprung back. The specific quality of ground cover, compressed by prolonged weight. Not a single impact, but extended contact. Something that had been still in one place for a significant amount of time. It was oriented directly toward my tent. I stood there and ran through the explanations. Deer bedding, a fallen branch somehow removed, some meteorological event I had slept through. I gave each of these its fair hearing. None of them held against the shape of the impression, or its orientation, or the specific quality of the compression, which was deepest at what would have been the outer edges, as though whatever made it had a wide base and had stood rather than lain. I broke camp that morning, drove out to the main road, sat in my car for a while with the windows up. I keep returning to the smell, to the fact that I woke for no apparent reason, to the specific detail that whatever had been standing on that hillside was close enough to my tent that it could have reached out and touched the nylon. It didn't. It stood on that hillside in the dark, and it watched my tent, and when I woke, the smell was already there. And then I went back to sleep, and by morning, it had been gone for hours. Whatever it was not afraid of me. It had no reason to do anything, and it did nothing. And then it left. That should be reassuring. I have told myself it is reassuring, and in most of the hours of most days, it almost is. But in certain quiet moments, I find myself wondering not about what it was, or why it came, or what it wanted. I find myself wondering how long it had been watching before that night. Whether my previous 5 nights out there had looked the same from the hillside, whether it had stood there before, and I had simply slept through it, and through it, and through it. And the only difference on the 5th night was that something had made this the night I almost woke up in time. Whatever lives in the deep woods, if it lives there, if it is a thing that lives in the way we understand living, it seems to have learned patience in a way that we have not. It stands still when we pass. It watches without acting. It waits in the dark near the tents of sleeping people and is gone before morning. It has learned the shape of our attention and what falls outside it. It has learned what we see and what we dismiss. It has had a long time to learn these things. Maybe that's neutral. Maybe the fact that every one of these encounters ended without harm means something consistent and important about the nature of what these things are, or what we are to them. Maybe we are simply part of their environment, no more concerning than any other animal that moves through their territory and moves on. Or maybe patience is just another word for waiting. And Maybe whatever it is waiting for is not something we would recognize as waiting from inside it. The way we would not recognize, from inside a single human lifetime, the patience of a mountain. Sleep well. And if you wake in the night for no clear reason, if you find yourself suddenly completely awake in the dark, listening to a silence that feels somehow inhabited, take a breath. It's probably nothing. It's almost certainly nothing.